Well, thank you very much, Richard. So, hello everyone, virtually, of course. Is it? So, I hope you're all well. I hope you're fully nourished before this presentation. So, now I'm going to get into it. So, as Richard has said, on the one hand, we're now living or starting to live in what we refer to as the new normal. And I'm going to be having conversations with you about the future of food. So, as a futurist, I look at the short, medium, and long-term futures. I work with all G20 governments. For a whole variety of different reasons, particularly when we have a look at the future of energy, infrastructure, transportation, supply chains, jobs, skills, and all kinds of different things. Now, when we actually look at the new normal, I remember having conversations with lots of different organizations about how even pre-COVID, the world was accelerating faster than ever before. Everything was changing and being disrupted at a greater rate than ever before. We weren't really in normal times pre-COVID. So now as everyone starts talking about going to new normal, I kind of have to argue, is this the new normal? And then what is normal anyway? So when we actually have a look at a lot of the crises that the world has gone through in the past, they have one common theme. They revolutionize society. So I'm going to prove this to you. Now, when we actually have a look at the 1300s in Europe, we had the bubonic plague, but it wiped out half the population. Now, on the one hand, it's believed that Europeans became more adventurous because you could either stay in Paris or London and get bubonic plague, or you could go on a ship. So a lot of people literally left and got onto ships and started exploring and all kinds of different things. On the other hand, basically because there was a physical shortage of scribes, there are an increasing number of people that believe that the first printing presses were actually innovated to get people, to allow people to print media because there was a shortage of scribes. So on the one hand, we saw an increasingly adventurous European society. On the other hand, we also saw an increase in innovation. Now, fast forward to kind of the 1918 sort of time frame, 1918, 1920, basically to the Spanish flu. Again, we kind of saw a similar thread. So on the one hand, we saw improvements in gender relations, where, for example, women were actually allowed to work in factories because we were coming off the back of World War I as well as a pandemic. In addition to that, when we actually have a look at the American startup ecosystem, it boomed, literally. And this is sort of where we saw Henry T. Ford basically creating his particular vehicles and all that sort of stuff, which we're actually disrupting again today. And you'll all be glad to know that even though there wasn't social media back in the 1918s, there were people who were anti-vax, basically there were people who were anti-mask, as you can see with this lineup here. So in one case, basically a lot has changed. In another case, basically nothing has really changed. Now, fast forward to today's pandemic, 100 years later. On the one hand, basically we see a massive acceleration. So this is just at every level. So from a business level, whether it's trying to cut through red tape or bureaucracy, the things that used to take decades or years to get done at the start of the pandemic got done in days. Think about moving work from home. Last week, I was actually in the Middle East, and they built an entire hospital or constructed an entire hospital at the airport. It took them 3 days. I mean, can you imagine basically the amount of red tape that they would have had to have gone through basically to get that done pre-COVID, let alone all the other things basically that we've actually seen. Secondly, we've seen the forced adoption of different digital technologies. All of a sudden, people who weren't comfortable using digital products or services were forced to. If it's lost on people, we had over half the world's population in lockdown roughly this time last year. So we were forced as a society and as individuals and as businesses to adapt, like it or not. That sense of urgency and immediacy. And then from an innovation perspective, again, organizations that were quite happy with the status quo suddenly found their physical premises shuttered overnight. They suddenly found that all of their consumers basically were interacting with them digitally or in different ways and all these kinds of other things. So we saw an explosion of innovation. For example, one of the innovations that we saw in the UK was the ability for surgeons to work from home using 5G, augmented reality, and teleoperations. So just to put that on the table, we actually had surgeons in the UK who were working from home while conducting surgeries at hospitals like Guy's and St. Tommy's. That would not have happened unless the pandemic had happened. And that's just one rather crazy example of innovation at the edge. Now, the other sort of question that a lot of people have basically is, as we start getting back to the new normal, what stays? Now, on the one hand, society regressed. On the other hand, basically, we progressed. So, for example, in America, basically, we saw more and more people go for drive-throughs. For example, cinema drive-throughs, etc., etc., etc. When we talk about progression in Italy, because it's different in different countries, a lot of Italians really loved going shopping physically. But now the majority of them are shopping online for obvious reasons, and they actually think that that's going to stick, which is why Amazon, for example, is now hiring 3,000 new people in Italy to try to take advantage, basically, of that e-commerce boom that they're seeing in that particular country. So different countries experience different things, and their cultures have changed in different ways. Now, one of the greatest things that COVID did for us all, as individuals, businesses, and as a global society, is it changed what we think we could do. It changed, at a fundamental level, the art of the possible. As I've already said, things that we didn't think that we could do, we did. And there's so many examples of that. Now, when we start having a look at some of the trends that we think are actually going to be sticking around, so for example, when we have a look at behaviors, cooking and eating. 91% of people who were cooking at home actually now think that they're going to do more of that. 58% of those people are actually going to be cooking at home because on the one hand, they think it's healthier and better for them, but it's also an opportunity for them to save money, which again is relevant post-COVID. In addition to that, when you actually have a look at drive-throughs, so these are traditional fast food drive-throughs, some of the fast food restaurants in America, 44% of their revenues now come from drive-through, and they think that that's going to be a behavior that sticks around. Digital natives, 40%, we saw a 40% increase in the number of people who say that they are going to go digital first in terms of from a consumer perspective. And then we have this, subscription overload. I mean, how many of you have got more than 10, potentially even 20 different subscriptions with different things? Basically, whether it's Netflix, basically whether it's Amazon, whether it's whoever it happens to be. Subscription overload is increasingly becoming a thing. And then when we actually have a look at the outdoors, unsurprisingly, post-lockdown, 92% of people want to be outdoors more. When we have a look at digital acceleration, as Richard alluded to, 41% of organizations are accelerating their automation initiatives, bearing in mind that the vast majority, for example, of the Fortune 500, as well as other organizations, were already automating. So this is an acceleration on top of an acceleration. We're also seeing the increasingly fast rollout of dark kitchens. So, for example, Travis Kalanick has been investing in dark kitchens over in California. So this is simply where you have a kitchen that increasingly is fully automated. So we have Flippy the robot that was hired by Cali Burger to flip burgers. He got fired. He then got rehired. And if you wonder why he got fired, it's because he was actually too fast for his human co-workers to work with. And then when they trained the humans how to work with the robot, they rehired the robot, which is nice. Yeah, at least he didn't lose his job. We also see dark warehouses. So for example, whether it's with Amazon, Walmart, Ocado, we now have the technologies to create fully autonomous dark warehouses. And that's everything from manufacturing to fulfillment to logistics and so on and so forth. When we have a look at autonomous systems, because autonomous systems, which are decision-making systems, are different to automation. Automation is typically quite dumb. It's if this, then that. Autonomous systems like self-driving cars and vehicles, for example, are more what if. So, for example, what if that pedestrian steps in front of me, the car? What decision should I make and what action should I take? So autonomous systems are very different to automation. Now, what we saw during the pandemic, for example, in California, as well as Texas, as well as New York, was the rapid approval by regulators of new autonomous systems. So, for example, in California, we actually had fully autonomous vehicles that were delivering food packages to the homeless because people weren't allowed out. So we also have digitization programs as well. Digitization basically of different industries was already an accelerating and big mega trend. However, now we have 65% of the Fortune 250 CFOs believing that they are going to offer work from home as the primary choice basically for their work, their staff. And that's generally, they're thinking sort of splitting it 3 days work from home, 2 days work in the office, but work in the office only if you need to or want to, or there is a value to the business or to you as an individual or as a team. We also see the rise of teleoperations, as I described basically with the surgery example. When we look at teleoperations, we had construction workers based in Germany using 5G and teleoperated drones. The teleoperated drone construction equipment was in South Korea. So what we had people in Germany building construction sites and buildings in South Korea 8,500 kilometers away. Technology is a rocket ship. 97% of all organizations are now accelerating their digital transformation programs. No surprise there at all. And when you actually have a look at reports basically from sort of Accenture, again, McKinsey, but also companies like Microsoft, it's generally believed that the rate of acceleration is now 5 to 7 years. So what would have taken a business 5 to 7 years to do from a digital transformation perspective, when you have conversations with Microsoft, they're saying we saw organizations do in 6 months that would have taken them 3, 4, 5 years basically to do. And again, speed of change accelerates. When we have a look at innovation, we have the increasing concept basically of what we call creative destruction. So annually people spend about $1.7 trillion basically on innovation. Almost every organization is now innovating and trying to disrupt themselves and their competitors more than ever before, because they were on the one hand forced to, but we're also going into a new world. So globally, according to the OECD and UNESCO, basically we're actually starting to see an increase in the amount of R&D spending of about 6%. And that's a huge amount. We also see machine innovation coming through. So machine innovation are artificial intelligences that can ideate a product, design a product, and innovate a product at extreme speed. Now, this applies to NASA, this applies to the food industry, this also applies to organizations like Toyota, as well as Under Armour. So for example, with Under Armour, so they used an artificial intelligence to create a sneaker called the Architect sneaker, which you can buy online for about $300. The AI designed it day one. It's a 3D printed sneaker as well, so day two, Under Armour can 3D print it in the back of their stores, which eliminates your entire global supply chain. Conversation for another time, perhaps. In Under Armour's case, as well as Toyota's case, they used it for an EV battery. Google are using these things to design computer chips. What we actually managed to do basically is we managed to reduce the time to go from concept to shelf by around 99%. Everything is speeding up. Startups, again, basically sort of during the height of the pandemic in the US, this is a US figure, we saw an 82% increase in the number of new company registrations. And then when we actually have a look at corporate venture capital, we saw an increase on previous records of 133%. So this 133% year-on-year increase is off the back of 2019, for example, that was already a CVC record year. When we have a look at markets, increasingly consumers are used to both digital and physical markets, no surprise there. Post-COVID, more businesses are looking to build back resilient businesses, which then means that we see an increase in diversification. But again, we also see an increase of disruption, innovation, R&D, and all those kinds of good things. So a lot of these are actually linked. We also saw the development of winner takes all. So when you have a look at the big tech giants, for example, as well as the other large multi-sided platforms, the top 7 large companies, so tech giants really, with multi-sided platforms, managed to increase their value by $3.4 trillion. While the laggards, value decreased by almost $1 trillion. So the leaders, people who are already data-driven, digital, who are already global, who are already at the forefront of disruption and innovation, as well as diversification and kind of the conglomerate piece, they just grew bigger. Again, this is not a surprise. We all know this, but just reinforcing. When we have a look at sustainability, sustainability has now gone on to steroids. It was already on steroids pre-COVID. It's now on even greater steroids post-COVID. So we increasingly see the rise of what we call ethical capitalism. So when you go and have conversations with younger generations and surveys and so on and so forth, depending on the country that the younger generations are in, between 54 to 94% of them believe that traditional capitalism is broken. Bearing in mind that traditional capitalism has generally been responsible for the raping and pillaging of the global world, polluting the planet, as well as treating workers increasingly like commodities. And we even have organizations who should remain nameless, who are actually managing their employees and firing their employees and being taken to the European Court of Justice for it using artificial intelligence. In fact, you use probably both of those organizations. One starts with an A, the other starts with U, and is a taxi company. We also saw a massive increase basically in global inequality as well. So we saw a 10% rise in global poor. Putting that in numbers, that's 155 million people around the world being pushed into poverty, or even more extreme poverty because of COVID. We saw an increase, or we have seen an increase of 40% in the number of households, both in the US, Europe, and globally, who now suffer from food insecurity. And we saw a 53% increase in what we call learning poverty. So it's no secret that as children weren't allowed to go to school, we saw many children actually regress by 6 months outside of any psychological impact that COVID has actually had, which a lot of people are still sort of trying to muse around. When we have a look at sustainable businesses as well, ESG stocks, from an investor perspective, now represent 34% of all assets under management. That's huge. So investors like BlackRock, Legal & General, and so on and so forth are now saying, as well as the European Union, who are backing these messages up, are saying if you aren't prioritizing ESG, we're going to deprioritize our investments in you. If you have an improvement in your ESG score, it adds about 0.5% to your share price. If you have a decrease in your ESG score, it knocks about 2 to 3% off your share price. We also see an increase in the circular economy. We've got BMW who are actually creating the iVision, which is a circular economy car, so we can actually create anything as a circular economy product. So a circular economy product is a product that's been designed where waste is seen as a design flaw. And then we have green deals, basically both in the US, Europe, and China, basically where all the governments basically is promoting a build back better, but build back greener programs. And that's a whole conversation in itself. So, however, when we actually have a look at exponential innovation, everything is being disrupted. So, for example, if you remember the Kodak moment, you don't want your own Kodak moment. When we have a look at this, technology is generally exponential. If I come to you today, and I say, I have a camera and it costs $7.2 million per megapixel and I can fit it into a rucksack, you'll tell me that I'm stupid, that it has no market, etc., etc., etc. In Kodak's case, they saw this sort of thing as a threat. But an exponential technology is a technology whose cost performance increases exponentially over time. That same megapixel today will cost you about 0.00014 cents. We have Samsung creating 200 megapixel sensors now, and it can fit easily, very easily fit on your fingernail. So technology gets better, cheaper, more performant, and smaller. And that is incredibly relevant when we talk about the future of food, where, for example, the price of a clean meat burger used to be $1.5 million per pound. It's now $363, and we can see a way to get to $5 per pound. So when we actually talk about creating the future, so creating future products and services, don't think about individual technologies. Think about technology combinations. And I'm not going to go through this, but you can download the codex basically from the website. When we have a look at the future of food, basically we are looking at advanced manufacturing, and we are also looking at a whole variety of other things. We have bioreactors, for example. We have increases in computing power, artificial intelligence, and all manner of other things. But when you start combining all of these different technologies together, you transform every single part of global business, culture, and society. And every industry is being disrupted. So when we have a look at the future of food, we're going to have a talk about that in a moment. When you actually have a look at the future of energy, the cost of generating electricity using renewables is now almost zero. So from your own perspective, increasingly the cost of powering all of your factories and plants and buildings basically is actually dropping to zero. I can already provide you with solar panels at 17% energy efficiency, and you can disconnect yourself from the grid, or you can sell it back to the grid. You can turn your buildings into virtual power plants courtesy of organizations like BP. When we have a look at finance, we see the rise of fintechs, decentralized finance, and robo-wealth advisors. When we have a look at healthcare, we have increasingly powerful gene editing tools. So if you are born with an inherited genetic disease, I can sit you in a hospital bed, put you onto an intravenous drip. I can feed a technology like CRISPR into your bloodstream. That clips out the bad gene, clips in a new gene. 30 minutes later, you actually don't have that inherited genetic condition. Now, we use that on Hunter's syndrome, which is a deadly condition, and you can use that same technology to cure 6,000 inherited genetic diseases. You can also use the same technology to grow new kinds of tomatoes and other things. And then we can 3D print human organs. Basically, we 3D printed a human heart in Israel about 6 months ago, and that's a whole other conversation. And then when we look at transportation, everything's going fully autonomous and everything's going electric. But when we have a look at the next industry, construction, the technologies that are starting to revolutionize the construction industry are also the same technologies, hybrid technologies that are being used to transform the food industry. So you actually have a lot in common, not only with the construction industry, but the space industry. And I'll explain that. So we can 3D print buildings, but actually there's no food in space. We'll come on to that. Now, when we actually have a look at the global food crisis, for example, the United Nations, basically by 2050, we will have 11 billion people on the planet. We will also have a growing middle class. We're already seeing a growing middle class in China, which is why China recently spent $300 million buying clean meat, basically from left farms. But slightly different story that we'll come to later. However, when we actually have a look at today's agricultural system, 70% of all of the world's fresh water that is consumed is used by the agricultural industry, bearing in mind that by 2030, 129 countries, according to the United Nations, are going to be in a state of water stress. There are going to be 5 billion people that will be exposed to water stress. This is unmanageable as we try to feed our growing population. In addition to that, the global agricultural industry is responsible for around 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions, including deforestation of the rainforest and. If I came to you as a business basically and said, so what I want to do is I want to use 70% of all of our resources to create something that actually ends up destroying our environment, etc., 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 you'd probably start kicking me out the building. But it gets worse. When we actually have a look at the effect of climate change, for example, so extreme weather on crop yields, even though we have better technologies, precision agriculture, and all these different kind of things, last year we saw a decrease basically in oat yields of 19% globally. We saw a decrease in wheat yields of 20%, and according to the Food and Drug Administration, 90% of all crop losses are now attributed to extreme weather. So what we have is we have a growing population that needs more protein, more meat, more commodities. We have extreme weather, which is getting worse, not better, which is having a greater impact on traditional farming. This is just compounding itself, surely. So we need a new way to produce food, I think. So let's reinvent food again. So this is Gertrude. Gertrude is a cow. And in 1945, there were actually plenty of cows. However, as a result of World War II, you couldn't buy whipped cream. So Mr. Rich decided that there had to be a way to give consumers what they wanted and produce whipped cream. And he did. So using soy, he created non-dairy whipped cream that was freezable and all these other benefits. And by the way, that last statement, he created whipped cream from soy. We're disrupting soy. I'll come to that in a moment. Let's bring this disruption full circle. So fast forward to the 1960s, and you started creating non-dairy creamer for coffee. At which point the dairy industry said, what are you doing? Because it started taking off. You started growing your market, eating into the incumbent space and their territory. And they were like, who are you? And Mr. Rich basically at the time came back with this statement. He said, it's not imitation, it's better than that. So disrupting the dairy industry. Today, fast forward, we're actually disrupting the coffee bean industry because now we have companies like Atomico who can create coffee that is allegedly better than Starbucks in taste tests without the coffee bean and without the environmental damage, by the way. And so the incumbents within that industry are already going, that's not real coffee. To which basically you can imagine the startup going back to them and saying, it's not imitation, it's better than that. It's funny how these things come round. Now, in addition to that, when we start having a look at the use of 3D printing, basically in the treat space, we can 3D print chocolate, but we can 3D print chocolate at the nanoscale, which lets us create new food colorings that are additive free, and we can actually 3D print new materials, edible materials, onto chocolate that give us holographic chocolates. You can go and buy those today. So 3D printing meets the chocolate industry and we get holographic chocolate that tastes great with a lower environmental footprint. When we look at vertical farming, so for example, we see Walmart, we see Amazon, Jeff Bezos has invested $250 million in this area in a company called Plenty, but there's another company called Inox, and there's another company called Aero Farms. Inox basically created the world's first fully autonomous vertical farm. So this is simply where we take an existing warehouse and we grow crops basically in that warehouse. So we take the crops out of the fields, we grow them in a warehouse. Now, the benefit of this basically from a farming perspective and a food production perspective and a societal perspective is these things have 95% less environmental impact. In fact, we can use 100% less herbicides and chemicals. We can also use 99% less water than a traditional farm. However, if I use a technology called hydro panels out of the Middle East that uses sunlight to capture water from the atmosphere, I can do one better. I can actually create a vertical farm that uses 100% less potable water. 100% less chemicals, 100% less potable water. That's revolutionary. In addition to that, these things can grow 8 times the yield. They can guarantee it because my warehouse isn't going to be wiped out by extreme weather like the wheat or oat crops or rice crops or paddies, etc., etc., etc. And even better, it's organic. But then even better, because it's actually an industrial process, it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And I can put it into your local town, which means no food miles. This seems like the future of farming to me. However, the farmers came back and guess what they said? They said, that's not real farming. And I've spoken to farmers because I actually live in a farming community. And they go, it's not real farming. And I go, well, why? And they go, there's no soil. I was like, okay, you have a point, but it's modern farming. That's it. Yeah, we start getting into some minutiae basically here. Now, in addition to that, when we actually have a look at the meat industry, basically we have plant burgers, basically with companies like Impossible Foods, who are now a multi-billion-dollar business. Less environmental impact. However, if you remember, I 3D printed a space habitat at Mars. I can use a very similar technology, 3D bioprinting, to 3D print, in this case, beef in space, in the space station. So we 3D printed beef in the space station, and can you guess what people came back and said? They said, that's not real meat. And okay, a little bit of a point there. However, when we actually have a look at cellular meats and cellular agriculture, which I'm going to show you in a minute, this is real meat. What if I could take a feather from a chicken and feed the world without killing the chicken? At the right price. Hey, Ian.
We've all been there, right? In the grocery store. Oh, I'll just buy this meat. And there it is. And all we have to do is buy it. We don't have to think about what it took to make that chicken in that nice packaging. But the reality of the way that it came about, it's incredibly unsustainable. And that's one of the biggest problems facing humanity right now. But we figured out a way to solve it. The whole idea is that that chicken in itself has an unlimited source of itself, and there is a way where you can take just a handful of cells and keep growing them essentially infinitely. For those very first cells, it was important to us how we got the cells, not just that we got the cells. We came up with the idea to use one feather from the single best chicken that we could find.
Let me pick down.
First thing we need to do is we need to identify a cell that we are going to use as the basic starter material. And then what we need to do is find a food for it to grow in. So we have to identify the right set of nutrients that will cause the cells to multiply, but not just multiply, but do so quickly and into high densities.
Wake up, I wanna lift you up.
That's it.
I wanna dress you up. Let's
That's
be
it.
friends.
It was an out-of-body experience to sit there and eat a chicken, but have the chicken that you're eating running around in front of you. You don't imagine doing something like that.
And guess what? So that is actually real meat. But the meat industry, especially in the US, said if you sell imitation meat, we'll sue you. And they did sue. To which the industry came back and said, it's not imitation, it's better than that. And then, as we saw in 2019, HR 4881, the Real Meat Act basically was passed, which means you have to market clean meat in a different way to real meat. But you can imagine the marketing. Clean meat, it costs the same as actual meat, except it's organic, it doesn't have the environmental footprint, or the food miles, or the rainforest destruction. It's a marketing job. In which case, the market came back and said, okay, you can sue us and you can put in the Real Meat Act, etc., but meh, we're going to buy loads of it, and they are. So this is now starting to get to $15 a pound, because one of the biggest problems that we saw was you have to use fetal bovine serum, which is a very, very expensive protein. University College of London is now developing a synthetic version, which does drop the cost of clean meat from 1.5 million years ago to $363 last year to $15 to $5 per pound, which is supermarket ready. And the cellular agriculturists also said, meh. What about fish though? Any
We are making history right now. At Finless Foods, we're taking the first step into creating a world where everyone has access to fresh, healthy, delicious, and sustainable seafood. We're proud to announce the world's first clean fish ever to be eaten. This means fish produced entirely without cruelty, not just dolphin safe, but fish safe as well.
All right, you ready? There you go.
Fish is known as one of the most healthy sources of protein on the planet, and we're eating more and more of it every day. Up to 90% of the world's fisheries are overexploited or depleted. Contaminants like mercury, plastic, growth hormones, and antibiotics are increasingly making their way into our favorite foods. We knew there had to be a way to produce seafood without causing the harm that it does now. We're looking at the biochemical process that happens inside of a fish and making it happen outside of a fish in order to produce the same seafood that people love to eat.
What they've done is they've started with nothing, and they've built themselves a whole technological platform to make food in a way that just hasn't been done before. Seeing that come to fruition today was an extremely moving experience, and I think also an important one in terms of how human beings eat.
Why would you choose to farm or fish wild fish with all that environmental and human health cost when you could just have it made by Finless Foods?
At Finless Foods, we're on a mission to revolutionize the way seafood is made.
So we have fish without the fish, animal with meat without the animal. But get this, I'm going to twist your mind. If I can take a cell from a chicken, grow it in a bioreactor and create a chicken nugget, which I can sell legally in Singapore because they've just approved the sale of that, or for KFC as part of their future food program, why can't I take a cell basically from a peacock, a panda, or a zebra, or a T-Rex, basically, and actually do exactly the same thing? So our relationship with food is changing. The type of foods that we can create are changing, and these solve the future global famine wars. We also have the technologies, we can use these same technologies to create dairy without kind of the chicken or the cow. So that's meat, eggs, whey protein. In addition to that, we really have to start thinking about this question. When will we see a chicken in a museum? And I really want you to sort of watch the next video. It's only sort of about a minute. But when are we going to see a chicken on Mars? So look for the chicken in this next little video. Bearing in mind you have things in common basically with the space industry. So hands up, anyone who saw the chicken? No. We are not going to be taking chickens to Mars because that's stupid, they cost too much money, and we can actually grow a chicken nugget in a bioreactor. There you go. So now, looking at proteins, what about making protein from air? Let's get slightly crazy about when we start talking about the future of foods. Now we can actually use a NASA-inspired technology, which was actually designed to grow proteins on Mars. We can use air. We can use bacteria, so hydrenochophs. That's it. I can't say the word. That's it. I'm a futurist. I am not an English scholar. And electricity. And we can grow proteins. And we can grow proteins that are competitive with whey and cost competitive with soy. Do you remember basically that Mr. Rich used soy to create his first non-dairy whipped cream? Let's disrupt soy. This might be the technology that Mr. Rich would have used basically back in the 1945s, perhaps. However, again, when we actually have a look at companies like Air Protein, that he's starting to use these proteins to create meat, guess what the incumbents say? Oh my God, that's not food. To which Air Protein reply, it's better than that. That's it. Now, and did I mention fruit? Of course, I haven't mentioned fruit yet. That's it. However, on the one hand, we can do all kinds of different things with fruit. On the one hand, we can genetically engineer it. I can create a square watermelon. I can create all manner of different fruit objects. I can even grow them with vaccines. The FDA approved one, basically for COVID, about a year ago. So things we can do with fruit are increasingly insane as well. But what about 3D printing or 4D printing fruit? Is this fruit? Is it? So this is literally 4D printed fruit. And we are stretching our definitions of what's possible, but also what we consider as culturally acceptable foods. And Nestle have turned this kind of thing into a multi-billion-dollar business. Discussion for another time, perhaps. But what about tracking these products through my supply chain? Well, we have edible electronics. Courtesy of Rice University, I can 3D print a graphene RFID sticker basically onto a strawberry, for example, when it's growing, and I can track that all the way through the supply chain, from farm, vertical farm, to stomach. And then combos. If I can do all of these different kinds of things, why can't I create a watermelon that tastes of orange, a steak that tastes of watermelon, or whatever it happens to be? So we see future patent wars basically coming as different organizations start patenting specific types of new flavors. We can do this kind of thing with leather as well. We can grow leather from cells, Modern Meadow in New York. We can do this with wood, courtesy of MIT. So we are literally transforming everything using cellular agriculture. And as for reinventing selling food, we have virtual food, courtesy of Japan. I can taste food and I can smell food. Now, on the one hand, this means that you could sell these virtual foods into e-gaming and e-sports platforms, just like the digital fashion industry are, and that's generating a multi-billion-dollar business right now for companies like Google, for Gucci, and so on and so forth. In addition to that, though, from a procurement perspective, why bring people from all the way around the world to test your new foods? You could just do it virtually. So we start disrupting that. And then finally there, when you actually have a look at that, or almost, we see fully autonomous vehicles. So for example, the thing that in red, this is the Citroen Skate, that's a fully autonomous hotel room. Would you deliver food to a fully autonomous hotel room? Does it have its own 3D printer or bioreactor in there, or what? That's a new way to get to consumers. And then finally, in summary, and I think I speak for all the leaders here, you're not disrupting hard enough if you're not being sued. In which case, lawyer up, and I do know some great artificial intelligence lawyers that saved JP Morgan Chase over 365,000 of man hours, and that's it. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and goodbye from me and Ian the Chicken, who survived the story.